Boy, do we have a big update in a case involving a Georgia 9th grade teacher accused of sexually abusing one of her own students.
Why do men have to be so creepy sometimes?
This teacher's name is Danielle Weaver, and she was pretty outspoken on TikTok. She showed a lot of personality on social media. She seemed to be that fun teacher who students could look up to, that teacher who perhaps they could relate to. But now she is facing decades in prison for what she allegedly did. And we just got our hands on the grand jury indictment. And frankly, the details of what Weaver allegedly did to one of her own students are sick. We're on the case presented by Law&Crime. I'm Stewart. The last time we talked about the teacher we're talking about today, Danielle Weaver, we knew that she was in big trouble for what she allegedly did. It was back in February, and the Georgia Bureau of Investigation had been called in to investigate her and investigate whether she had molested one of her own students. But at that point, the details surrounding what she allegedly did, that hadn't been released. We just knew that she was going to be facing charges potentially. But all of that now has changed in the wake of the documentation that we just got our hands on in just the last day or so. And Weaver is now facing 8 charges, including multiple counts of child molestation. Police are alleging she sexually abused a student multiple times. That not only includes multiple times allegedly on school property, but even in the parking lot of a fast food restaurant. Now, before we dive into the new details we have on this case, let's go back a little bit and very quickly show you what allegedly led up to all of this.
A blue raspberry fruit roll up, and I put strawberry ice cream in it. It's really good. Listen. And it's crunchy. Got my sweet pregnancy fix on tonight.
So this is one of several videos that we found from Danielle Weaver on TikTok. She appears to have been very active on social media. She was a 9th grade teacher at Lee County High School in Leesburg, Georgia. This is a small town. It's outside of Albany, Georgia. If you know the state, about 2.5 hours from Atlanta. Now, Weaver's school, and it's her former school now, had roughly 1,400 students. And Weaver, on a personal life standpoint, appears to have been married at the time of her arrest. So she was a wife. And I'll get into why was is a key part of that here in just a moment. But very sadly, she's also a mom. And this is someone who had a child of her own and is now accused of sexually abusing a child. On social media, Danielle had pictures with who appears to be her husband, and he is taking action against her in the wake of her arrest and where this criminal case has gone. Now, speaking of social media, I want to show you this because this is Weaver with some of her students, it seems, posting on social media. And this is a post talking about how students should dress appropriately at school. Weaver did appear to be that fun teacher. And we all probably had a teacher like this growing up, someone who might be a little bit younger, someone who you can relate to, someone who you can potentially confide in and trust in a way that maybe an older teacher can't. Seems like she brought a lot of great energy to the classroom of this high school, to the 9th grade classroom that she taught in. And she doesn't have a massive age gap compared to some of the other cases we've seen involving teachers accused of sexually abusing students. But in this case, it is incredibly notable because she is roughly 30 years old. And this victim, we have learned, is allegedly under the age of 16. Now, even though she may seem like that teacher you can trust, these allegations are laying out that, if true, that certainly was far from the truth.
Hey, y'all. So it is 6 o'clock, and I am just now getting home from work. So guess what I got? Chick-fil-A.
Weaver also did love to share her personal thoughts on social media. This is one of her TikToks here.
Okay, I just need to know something for a minute. Why do men have to be so creepy sometimes? I am leaving Burlington. All I have to do is go in there and return something, minding my own business, okay? And then I'm walking to my car, minding my own business. And this man that was walking in just started talking to me like he knew me and asked me, what kind of vape you got? I didn't have nothing in my hands. All I had was my purse strapped around me. I said, what? He said, what kind of vape you got? I ain't got no vape.
So previously, we knew the investigation against Danielle Weaver started in February. That's when law enforcement was brought in. But now we are learning about her alleged crimes, and they appear to have happened, and again, all of this is alleged, weeks before that. So let's lay out this new information we have from the grand jury indictment out of Lee County Superior Court in Georgia. So this indictment lays out what Weaver allegedly did, and it goes count by count. There are 8 counts total, and count 1 alleges that in Weaver's classroom, so we're on school property here, it says that she did commit an immoral and indecent act to and with the victim who is under the age of 16 with the intent to arouse and satisfy the sexual desires of both said accused and said child by kissing and fondling him, and it continues on. Now, count 2 alleges similar activity, but this time it happened, quote, in the school store. Both of these alleged incidents happened sometime between January 20th and January 23rd. So those are 2 alleged sex acts that took place on school property. Then you have count 3 that alleges that Weaver sexually abused the same student on January 24th in the parking lot of a Sonic fast food restaurant. Then January 26th, Weaver allegedly sexually abused that student in her car in the parking lot of their school. Now, that is the 4th count of child molestation that Weaver is now facing. And then there's 4 other counts, and those all are for the charge of sexual contact by employee or agent in the first degree. And those charges do match up with the dates and locations of the alleged sexual abuses that happened in the previous 4 counts. So we know that police were first called to investigate on February 3rd. And then the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the statewide agency, they were called in to investigate the next day. But it wasn't until February 17th that GBI filed warrants for Weaver's arrest. Weaver then turned herself into the county jail on February 18th, and she was held on a $50,000 bond, and she was able to post that, and she's been released. Now, reportedly, according to WALB television, her bond conditions say that she can't have any direct contact or indirect contact with the alleged victim, be within a mile of that alleged victim. It also says she cannot return to any education facility for someone under the age of 18 in Lee County unless she has a member of law enforcement with her, and she is only allowed to go there and collect personal belongings. Now, in a statement to parents obtained by WALB, the Lee County school system said this, quote, reports and rumors are circulating concerning alleged inappropriate contact between a teacher and student in a Lee County school system. We at the 9th grade campus can confirm that there is an ongoing legal investigation involving law enforcement concerning the alleged conduct of a former staff member who is no longer working for the district. Upon discovering the allegations, school and district leadership acted immediately to ensure the safety and well-being of students, as well as to conduct a thorough investigation. The individuals who have been directly affected have been contacted. The district will continue to cooperate with law enforcement as well as with those affected to ensure that no obstacles to resolving the investigation exist. The safety and well-being of our students remains our highest priority. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. So that is from the school system back in February, around the time that Weaver was arrested. Now, there are mandatory reporting laws in Georgia, as there are in many states, where people have to report if they have reasonable cause to believe that a child has been abused or neglected, and this includes allegations of sexual abuse. Now, GBI and the local law enforcement agency there in Lee County, they haven't come out and said how this case was reported to them and who the people were, the person who came forward with these allegations. Now, as we mentioned, Danielle Weaver is not only accused of being an alleged sexual predator, but you just think of how these cases impact so many people. Not only do you have the alleged victim and that victim's family and what they're going through, but you also have the people who are closest to the person who is now facing charges in this case. Danielle Weaver is a mom, and that's a child who, if all of this is true, will be impacted in some way, I am sure, by all the attention surrounding their mom. But also, Danielle Weaver was married at the time of her arrest. And it appears, according to court records out of Georgia, that her husband filed for divorce in the wake of her arrest. The filing was put in on February 19th, so that's a day after Weaver turned herself into authorities on the charges, including child molestation. That was back in February. Now, the document alleges that Weaver's husband left her on February 5th, which is the day after GBI was called in. And the filing also says the marriage is irretrievably broken. Weaver's husband filed for custody of the couple's children and for possession of the couple's home, according to those court records out of Lee County Court. Now, there has not been an update related to the civil proceedings in this case since March, and it is unclear at this point when Weaver is next due in court, now a couple days after she has been indicted on those 8 counts. Now, the divorce filing makes no mention of the criminal case against Danielle Weaver. Joining us now to talk about this is former sex crimes prosecutor Dan Shore. Always great to have you here on Law and Crime. What do you make, like, now that we're seeing what a grand jury has indicted Danielle Weaver of, and of course, these are all allegations and she's innocent until she's proven guilty. What do you make of what's been laid out from a timeline standpoint involving this teacher?
Well, according to the allegations and the indictment, this is not a one-time incident, that there are allegedly multiple instances, possibly 4, where the defendant had a student in her school engage in sexual interactions with her in different places, in a parking lot and other locations. It's according to the indictment, she had him touch her vagina with his fingers. And that is obviously concerning for a lot of reasons. One, that she's an authority figure at the school over him. Second of all, he's underage. The indictment says he's under 16 years old. So this is certainly very serious allegations. As you said, she's innocent until proven guilty, but certainly this is a serious indictment.
I hate to even ask this question, but you know in the indictment that they did not have sexual intercourse. They certainly have, you know, as you alluded to, sexual contact. Does any of that matter in a case like this, as from a prosecutor's standpoint?
It does. It changes the level of egregiousness and possibly the count that the person's charged with and maybe convicted of, and also sentencing. So having digital penetration of her vagina, which is what is alleged, is very serious because he's under 16 years old. That is sex abuse. Sexual intercourse would be even a higher level of criminal violation if it was proven beyond a reasonable doubt, and would probably, if that occurred and if that was proven, lead to lengthier sentence if there was an incarceration as part of the sentence. So it's a level of seriousness in change, but they both categorize as sexual abuse.
We don't know how law enforcement got involved in this case. According to the indictment, the sexual incidents allegedly took place late January, and then you have local police called in on the 3rd, GBI's called in on the 4th, then she's arrested on the 17th of February. As far as how these cases come to be, and I look at the first 2 counts and I notice that it happened sometime between the 20th and 23rd, and then the count where it's at a Sonic, allegedly a Sonic parking lot, a fast food restaurant, that's more specific, saying it happened on the 24th. What does that tell you potentially about how these allegations came forward?
It's really hard to tell. I've prosecuted and investigated many situations like this, and usually when it involves an underage person and a teacher or someone else in authority at a school, it's reported by somebody else, maybe another person at the school or a parent or guardian of the alleged victim who reports it. I don't see that many where the underage person themselves is the first person to report directly to law enforcement. Often they will tell someone else who then reports to law enforcement, but we certainly don't know in this case. And then when there's an ongoing series of sexual interactions, as is alleged here, it's very common that people don't always remember the exact dates that they occurred if they were over a certain period of months. So it's common in cases like this to say, oh, this incident I know happened on this date because, you know, this specific location is memorable. Other interactions, especially if they happened in school and you're in school all the time, you may not remember specifically what date they occurred on. So that's very common in cases like this.
So I also wonder, just what went through my mind is those first two counts. One is allegedly took place in a classroom. The other is in the school store. So probably a place where students could go like buy stuff. And then the third count, which was more specific on the 24th, is the Sonic restaurant, which would have, we know that probably has surveillance video of potentially a car that would go in there. I don't know if that exists, but then the school, I'm unsure whether they would have surveillance video. But let's just say it's, allegations from a person or potentially the victim in this case. Like, how strong of a case do you have if it is, those first two counts, it's just one individual saying that it took place?
Sure. Well, that's a great question. I mean, first, I would say that I deal a lot with security cameras in investigations I'm doing, and most security cameras delete their footage after about 30 days. So here are some of the allegations are in January of 2026. And hopefully, if there was security footage, they were preserved by law enforcement when they got involved within the next month or so. That's certainly the first step that an investigator or law enforcement does. Not every part of a building has coverage for law enforcement to get footage. So certainly that's something to look into. Now, if there's not security footage, what other evidence might there be? Well, certainly was the younger underage person, were they talking to other people in contemporaneous manner about what happened? So maybe they were telling friends, telling family, and maybe this text messages, I've seen cases I've had where they text a friend that something just happened with this teacher or authority figure at my school. And that provides some corroboration of what happened. And then also the law enforcement attempt to interview the defendant. And we don't know much about that, but usually they'll try to talk to them. Sometimes, we've had cases, Chris, we've talked about where someone confesses and admits to it, and sometimes they don't. So those are some of the things that people look to. And also other people in the school who might have noted interactions between them that maybe they thought blurred the lines of what was appropriate but didn't rise to the level of sex abuse. That can sometimes be corroboration also.
And I also look at so it's 8 counts she's now facing. That's significantly more than when we first talked about this case. And what we knew back then was, GBI had gotten involved. There was an arrest warrant for Danielle Weaver, and that she was going to face a charge. And I think at that point it was a child under 18. And then now specifically it's an under 16 charge that she's facing. But you have 4 counts of child molestation. And it seems like those are the specific incidents that allegedly took place. And then on top of that, there are 4 additional charges. And these are sexual abuse by an educator or an agent. So this is someone who holds a position of authority, a state position. How do those charges, and we're talking about Georgia here, but I know a lot of different states have laws like that. How do those impact a case, knowing that you can put those on top of the specific molestation charges that she's facing?
So for each actual alleged incident, there might be multiple charges because it falls under different categories in the criminal law. And usually if someone is convicted, they'll receive a sentence that goes along with the highest range of sentencing for that particular range of charges for that incident. So you're not going to get consecutive time for that incident if there's multiple charges. Usually and by consecutive time, I mean when you serve a certain sentence and you start serving another sentence. However, each individual incident, you could potentially get consecutive time. In other words, you will serve one sentence, then another, and another. So if there's 4 different incidents, that is much more significant in terms of conviction and sentencing than how many charges there are for each individual action, because usually those run together concurrently.
I think about, these cases and we talk about a lot of them. I think they're important to talk about because especially if you're a parent out there, I mean, you see someone like Danielle Weaver on social media and she seems like the fun teacher. She's the one who might be a little younger than some of the other teachers, someone who you can relate to. I think we've all had those teachers in our lives, but we've also talked about a lot of cases where those teachers are people who are accused of crimes like this. And one question I get, just talking to people about these stories is like, how does it get to this point? Like, how is it? Like, you look at her, fun teacher, all this stuff. She's married at the time. And those divorce proceedings are continuing on. She's a mom. And then here we are, and you're reading through this indictment and you're like, how is this the same person? And I know this is like a very general question I'm getting to, but like in your line of work, like, how is it that these situations happen where a teacher is sexually abusing kids? And I know that it's a teenager and all of that. And 15 years old, and we'll talk a little bit about the stigmas of it. But just like in your experience, and we don't know in this case, like how the relationship got to this point, but like, how does it in a lot of these cases where it just ends up being where a teacher can be facing charges like Danielle Weaver is?
Sure. Well, first of all, in many cases that I've investigated and prosecuted, it is the teacher or authority figure who does seem very friendly, who does seem very approachable, who is most likely to be found having done something inappropriate. That doesn't mean that every friendly teacher is sexually abusing people, because that's obviously not true. But sexual abuse by authority figures, by teachers, almost always does not happen instantly. There's not just someone who starts engaging just in sexual contact. Usually there's a period of ingratiating themselves to the student, and then this boundary probing where they are getting more personal in terms of what they're talking about. And then maybe there's some touching that's not sexualized touching specifically, but might be touching on the shoulder or other ways. So there's a grooming period that often leads to the sex abuse. And who's in a best position to groom someone like that? Someone who is friendly, is approachable. The person who is coming off mean and unapproachable is probably not going to be able to groom someone. So unfortunately, because I don't want people to be overly paranoid about friendly teachers, because there's a lot of friendly teachers who are amazing, but certainly those are the people who are in the position to be trusted. And I've talked about this on your program before, how often in cases of child sex abuse, it is the person who is trusted the most who is the person who is engaging in sex abuse. The stranger danger stereotype of just a stranger assaulting someone does happen, but it's much more rare than a person in a position of trust taking advantage of that trust. And I think that's how these situations often develop.
And I get frustrated about it too, because I think like there's so many teachers that do, I mean, 99% of teachers, 0.9% are not people who are accused of crimes like what we're talking about here. But then it's like, for each story like this, I'm sure there are parents out there who get more paranoid to the teachers that actually have a profound impact on young people in the best of ways. And it just makes so many people look bad, and it impacts so many people in a negative way. And like with this story too, Danielle Weaver's husband's filed for divorce. We see that a lot in these cases. You have children with a couple, they're involved and going to be impacted by this. Like, what do you see when it comes to just, because it's not only just the victim, and the victim's the most important person in all these cases, and the victim's family and the impact on them and the trauma that all of this can have. But I think of just the massive amount of people who get impacted by cases of this when you have a teacher that does something like what this teacher's accused of.
Absolutely. There are many, many lives that are ravaged here, both besides the victim and this defendant. Also, as you said, the defendant's family, the victim's family, other people at the school, all the people who feel now they can't trust other teaching personnel at that school and other schools. And it has devastating effects. And especially for someone who's a victim of child sex abuse, it has long-lasting traumatic effects that can last a lifetime, whether someone is male or female as the victim, and whether the defendant is male or female. We've talked about that, previously on your program. So I think that when people just see it as an isolated situation between two people, that's really wrong, and that there are so many lives here that are scarred because of what happened.
How does, and in this case, we're talking about a divorce, like how do those civil proceedings, I guess, how do those move forward when you still have a criminal case that hasn't been proven yet?
Right. So the husband of the teacher filed for divorce. That can proceed. I would assume that if there was any deposition that went along with the divorce proceeding, that this teacher would not agree to that, because they would take the Fifth Amendment because they have pending criminal charges. So it would probably stop questioning, because anything that someone said during a divorce proceeding could then be used by the prosecution. But that's up to both this teacher and her husband to figure out whether they're going to have a divorce that leads to depositions and questioning, or whether they just work things out in a different way. But certainly it's understandable why someone would want to get divorced if their spouse was accused of having sexual contact with someone who was under 16 at their school.
And then from the civil side, I mean, we often see, and I don't know of any lawsuit at this point that's been brought against the school district, or whether that's a lawsuit that would have any merit. But we do know 3 out of the 4 alleged incidents were on school property, once in the classroom, once in the school store, and then once in a car in a school parking lot. How does that impact? Because you still have a student, every single one of these incidents, who's the alleged victim, and whether it's on, a sonic parking lot or it's at a school. I mean, how much does the location of the incidents matter when it comes to any sort of litigation a school district could face?
Well, the fact that it happened on school property certainly might affect the exposure of the school to litigation. And some of the big factors that would be considered are, what did the school know? What should they have known? What were their policies and procedures like? Did they have a culture at the school where people who might have seen suspicious activity would report that? It's really hard for a school to just be liable just because a teacher did something if there's no way they could have known that the teacher was doing it. But many schools that I've conducted investigations for, we found that there was suspicious activity reported and the school either ignored it or didn't put it through the proper procedures. And that led to maybe the teacher feeling emboldened to continue to sexually abuse someone. And that's when there's severe liability. So certainly there needs to be an internal investigation done by the school, whether it's by an internal investigator or an external investigator, to find out who knew about the teacher's interactions with the student beforehand, what did they know, what was reported, and what was done by the school. And also looking forward, what can they do to make sure this doesn't happen again? What kind of warning signs can they encourage people to report? What kind of a culture do they want to develop so people can step up and say something if they see suspicious interactions?
Yeah, and we'll see what happens next in this case. Very, very disturbing allegations against this teacher out of Lee County, Georgia. Dan Shore, I know you write about a lot of these types of situations, both fiction and nonfiction. Where can people find your work?
Sure. My latest novel, which is about sex abuse of underage people at a school, my novel is called Open Bar. It's available anywhere where books are sold. And you can also find more information by looking for me on Substack.
Yeah, really important work. I mean, again, I just think that these stories are really important to talk about because it just, it shows so many warning signs, but hopefully not in a way where people become paranoid, because there are so many great teachers out there. Dan Shore, former sex crimes prosecutor. Always great to have you on Law and Crime. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Chris. It's always good to talk to you.
That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law and Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify, and we are also now streaming on Peacock. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.